Morning. Okay, as you just heard, we're recording this session. So please use the chat to ask questions or add comments for Dr. Robinson. I'm Deb Meyer, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat this morning so that we can get in as many questions as possible. Hopefully, we may have time for some Q&A at the end of the hour, but in the last 5 minutes, I'll be providing some information on professional credit and we'll be doing a book giveaway. So let's get started. This session leads perfectly into the last session if you were there. It's Teaching STEM to Change the World with Dr. Teresa Robinson, who is my colleague at Elmhurst University. And I'm really excited to introduce Teresa as an invited speaker today. In her program description, you'll learn that she is a science educator who is currently the director of secondary and middle grades education at Elmhurst. Teresa has a long career in teaching. She began as a classroom teacher. She's provided professional development and now works in P12 preparation. And one of the things she did not share in that bio, which you can read for yourself, is she currently is a principal investigator on a National Science Foundation grant that's focused on increasing STEM educator preparation and culturally responsive teaching. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to Teresa. Thanks so much, Teresa.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Jen, and the Center for Success for High Needs Schools for having me today. Thank you for that warm welcome and introduction to who I am. Today's topic is Teaching STEM to Change the World. And I am giving credit to part of this title from a book that I read when I started working in teacher preparation by Oakes and Lipton, titled Teaching to Change the World. And it was when I read this book as an educator. I was teaching pre-service science teachers. And prior to that, I had been a doctoral student. I taught high school at DuSable High School on the south side of Chicago. I had taught at North Lawndale College Prep on the west side of Chicago. But prior to that, my training as a science educator with a degree in biology had been what we would call very traditional and classical from Southern Illinois University, where we have the largest collection of the John Dewey artifacts. And so I had not been prepared as a science educator to teach in what we might call more liberal ways. I had been schooled in Jerome Bruner, Buber, Foucault, of course, John Dewey. And it was this book that introduced me to the idea that I really had a locus of control as an educator to actually change the world through my classroom. So one thing that I'm going to do here is make sure that you all have a copy of a template for this presentation that you can use. So I will share that in the chat coming up here shortly with everyone. So you don't have to worry about taking copious notes as we go along. So I'll make sure to have that. But this quote here, I think, sums up one of my major philosophies as it relates to teachers, especially pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, as they are thinking about how to impact change, because most of us get into education with very altruistic purposes for why we want to teach. And it says, when I do not know myself, I cannot know who my students are. I will see them through a glass darkly in the shadows of my unexamined life. And when I cannot see them clearly, I cannot teach them well. And so the work that I do in teacher preparation as it relates to culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, all of those terminologies begins with the teacher. We tend to focus on the student, as we should, but there's some work that we must do as teachers and pre-service teachers with examining who we are, not only our biases, but who are we as cultural beings. So these are the expectations for today's presentation. And if you are in this session as an elementary, whether pre-service or in service, I like for you to put a number 1 in the chat. If you are representing middle level education, grades 6 through 8, even though the state of Illinois is now recognizing that as 5 through 8, I'm going to say for this session 6 through 8, number 2. So number 1, if you're representing elementary education. Number 2, if you're representing middle grades education. 3, if you're secondary 9 through 12. And if you are from higher education, a number 4. Just so I can get an idea of who we have here. Okay, some elementary, some secondary, some higher ed. Okay, some middle school. We have the gambit here. So on our overview for in the description of the presentation, you have these objectives, but I'd like to orient us to them so that we are focused on what it is that I intend for us to get out of this session. And one is to orient you to the use and benefits of culturally relevant pedagogy in STEM education. The other is to explore some ways to teach it to disrupt patterns of inequity in schooling. 3 is to understand and be able to use a method that I've termed the SALK method. If you are a science educator, you should know the name SALK, Sir Jonas Salk, uh, popularized for the discovery of the polio vaccine, which we now know it was the cells of Henrietta Lacks that made that vaccination possible. So that is a way that I like for you to remember, if of all the terms and all the things that we can remember, because there's lots of things to remember. If you can remember Salk, then that's a really good mnemonic for you to focus on how I can center culturally relevant, culturally responsive, and culturally sustaining pedagogies. And then lastly, to develop a curricular and instructional plan for teaching STEM for social justice, which is a bit different than CRP. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. The moderator will interrupt me at any time to ask any of those questions, and I will pause at any time to answer any of those questions that you all may have. Please feel free to write those in the chat and interrupt. So let's start with some pedagogical terminology. I mean, we are the alphabet soup profession, and we know, and sometimes it can get a bit tricky. In 1993, Banks came up with this idea of multicultural education, and we were really under that for many years. 1993 is over 25 years ago. I still believe in multicultural education. There were some camps who were saying, "Oh, well, we're not really thinking about sustaining the multiculturals and the idea of celebrating everyone." In 1994, which isn't a long while, we all know the famous Gloria Latson Billings coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy. Sometimes we see that referred to as culturally relevant teaching, culturally responsive pedagogy. And there are 3 tenets that I hold to from that school of thought. And they are: 1, students must experience academic success. And Deb was right. The prior presenter talked a lot about social emotional learning as it relates to academic success. But one of the tenets that I don't want to get lost with culturally relevant teaching is that students must experience academic success. 2 is that students must develop and maintain cultural competence. Students must maintain and develop cultural competence. Now, maintain cultural competence, that means who I am. Develop means if I am not of a certain cultural group, that I am developing cultural competence for that group. That's why CRP is for all students: white, Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Muslim, all students. And so we go back to that initial quote where teachers must do the work of examining who they are, We live in a pretty biracial world now where it's not as black and white as we like to think it is, where people have multiple identities. Well, in 2015, Alim and Paris came up with an idea, and they said, you know what? We don't want to be responsive to students' culture. We don't want it to be relevant. We want to sustain. And so now I've picked that up and I've done some work on it. It's from 2015, and it's to perpetuate and sustain the histories and languages of students. I think that's very relevant because we live in a pluralistic society. I'm going to move forward, but again, don't feel rushed to have all of this. So in 2011, those of you who are science educators, you know that the science education community developed our next generation of science standards. But what preceded that, which we don't talk a whole lot about, was a framework for K-12 science education. And for the first time over many years of creating standards, the National Science Teachers Association, in partnership with AAAS and the National Research Council, developed and created a chapter solely on equity and diversity in science education. And if you are not familiar with that, you should go back. If you are a science educator, if you've not read it, you should read chapter 11. Now, because we have a lot to get through in about 50 minutes, I'm not going to go into the minutia of what that chapter is about, but it identifies the sources of inequity in STEM education, particularly science education. I stand corrected because it is a science education document. But it's the framework for understanding that three dimensions of the standards. Those of you who are studying to be science educators know that there are three dimensions now to our standards. It's not one dimensional anymore, where it's simply content driven. There's three dimensions. Now, moving forward, the Salk method for CRP is something that I've not published yet, but I do take ownership because I've created it, but I'm sharing it with you here. And a way for us to remember, and you to remember, how we can approach STEM as a culturally relevant, culturally responsive, pedagogical strategy. One, this S is science as a cultural accomplishment. And this is aligned to what the framework says for us, that we should be teaching STEM as a cultural accomplishment. When we talk about seeing ourselves and our students seeing themselves reflected in the curriculum and the instruction, one way, one way that we can do that is to look at STEM as a cultural accomplishment. The second is action and expression. And those of you who come from the special education or have studied special education understand the differentiation, but more specifically, universal design for learning, UDL. One of those components is action and expression. The third L is language and discourse. And then the K is for knowledge of students. Now, if we look at those areas, which I will spend a little more time on, those are the four areas that I like for you to think about when we think about how to integrate CRP into our STEM curriculum and instruction. So multicultural education, and the citation is here from 1993 from Banks, Multicultural Education, Historical Developed Dimensions and Practice. He lists five areas for us to work towards for diverse students to experience educational equality. So, I know that it's very popular right now to talk about inequity, diversity, and inclusion, but there are scholars who have been doing this work for over 25 years. And Banks is one of those. And he's out of I think, the University of Seattle. One is, especially for the elementary educators in the room, content integration. We see a focus on reading and math in elementary education, but I like to ask you, reading about what? There's lots of things to read, and there's lots of books that have themes around science, technology, engineering, and math that students can read about. Lots of trade books. One of my favorite for middle school is The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate. The Evolution of Calpurnia Tate, was recommended to me by a social studies educator at Elmhurst University who's gone on, Dan Jarris, gave me the book. It's young adult literature. I read the book. I devoured the book in probably 2 days. Now, full disclosure, I am a science educator, and I'm very typical of a science educator where I don't really like a whole lot of words on a page if there aren't charts and graphs and pictures. There are students who are that way. It's overwhelming. Now, I read very well. Obviously, I have a doctorate and I can read, but unless it's interesting to me, I'm not going to read it. And I've been that way since I've been in middle school. And there are children who are that way. It's not that they can't read or don't like to read, but it's not something that they're interested in. So the first book that I ever read in middle school was the How the Caged Bird Sings. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. Prior to that, we had been reading, books about dogs and wolves and things like that, and I just refused, as an act of resistance, to not read those books. So when we integrate the content with those things that are of interest to our students, especially in elementary and middle school, we can get some of those goals of multicultural education reached. Next, he refers to the not how do we actually make meaning, and what is that process? And so we have to help students go through that. It's actually one of the action and expression themes from UDL, but teachers help students understand how knowledge is created and how it's influenced by the racial, ethnic, and social class positions of individuals and groups. Now, I'm not going to go too much in deep with that. That's a whole presentation in and of itself. And I'm sure you all are smart enough, your doctoral students and grad students, you've probably had some experience with that. Number three is how do we reduce prejudice? Right? We talk about inequity all the time, but as teachers, if we want to change the world, really where we can do that is in our classrooms. And so if you are teaching in a classroom that is, not very diverse or is diverse, there are ways that we can work at the school level to reduce prejudice. And one of those ways is to speak up and have courage to do so at the school level. When we hear things being said or done that influence policies at the school level. So this is about affecting change in our classroom and at the school level. And then there's equity pedagogy, which we're talking a little bit about now. And then empowering school culture and the social structure in the schools. STEM as a cultural accomplishment. Here are some examples. Now, if in a traditional classroom, science classroom, K through 12, you're going to always learn about Gregor Mendel, Watson and Crick, and Alan Shepard, right? We all know about Gregor Mendel, Foundations of Genetics, but a multicultural scientist that we don't often see reflected in the textbook is Ernest Everett Just, who really did the foundational work partly at the University of Chicago and partly abroad because of prejudice, was the role of the cell surface. I mean, I don't know how many biologists here are high school, but you can't do anything in genetics without understanding the role of the cell surface. Well, he was foundational for that. Well, we all know, or we should know now, about the contributions of Rosalind Franklin. Watson and Crick are credited. I'm sorry, I'm moving your pictures around here. At some place they're on the ribbon on the side and I can't see, so I'm doing that. That's what the stuttering's about. So Watson and Crick are credited with the double helix structure of publishing their paper about it, but the work was being done simultaneously by Rosalind Franklin, a woman in STEM. And then we know about the first American in space, Alan Shepard. We now know about Katherine Johnson and the others because of the popular film Hidden Figures that popularized it. But for how many years were those women hidden? And they were known as computers, which in mathematics to compute, but they were the original computers. So those are some examples of ways that we can look at science, technology, engineering, math as a cultural accomplishment, because we do it already. Most science textbooks start with looking at the fathers of different STEM fields. So we do it already for those who may, and I'm sure this not this crowd, but there are some there. How do I do it? I have to get to so many things. Well, these things are already in the textbooks. A is for action and expression. It's UDL. We're going to look at popular films, music, and film as a way to have students have multiple ways to express what they know and how you, as an educator, approach teaching. Action and expression. Action on the part of the teacher, and multiple ways for students to express what they know. These are three that I've pulled out: music and film, social media, especially for the older students, and then the use of technology. Now, I know we have our feelings about social media, but the matter of fact is that for the most part, students are using it. And we all know now about the importance of teaching with technology, but more importantly, about technology, right? And we know that there's some sources of inequity there, but nevertheless. So there is some popular music. Now, I am or did come on of age in the hip hop era, and so one of the songs that was very popular. Now it's 1999, so this is 20 years ago. So most high school students will probably not know that song. There is a website for lyrics.com. I'm going to share all of that with you prior to this session being over. And all the lyrics to songs are there, and they are kosher, if you will. So, New World Water is not necessarily a popular song right now, but it is a song that is a hip hop song that students can use, and it has themes of environmental justice, environmental racism embedded in the lyrics. So here's some questions. How is water personified in the song? What activities do humans use water for other than drinking? And what does the writer predict will happen to the Earth's water? So in 1999, Mos Def, otherwise known as Yasin Bey, wrote this song and performed it. It's on YouTube. You can look it up. But again, there are some words that may not, I don't think are appropriate even for 9 through 12 graders, just because I don't ascribe to using any profanity. And I know that there are some people who have different feelings about that. But for me, I would black those out or use the clean version. And then that's for the 9th through 12th graders. And then for the K through 8, there's Michael Jackson's Earth Song, right? Now, it could be seen as a little corny to some students, but it really has emotions. So if we're talking about helping students with English language arts, what emotions are expressed by Michael Jackson in the Earth Song? And I'm sorry we don't have time to listen to it today, but it does go from a range of emotions. And you can have students identify those emotions. And as it relates to the earth, what is he singing about? There are popular films, especially during this pandemic. I know that teachers have focused a lot on using films, but that's nothing new to us science educators. There's a website called NewYorkScienceTeacher.com. It's been around since I was teaching, which has been over 15 years ago that I started teaching high school. Here are some titles: The Day After Tomorrow, Something the Lord Made, The Core, I Am Legend, Outbreak. Reached peak popularity during the pandemic. Very popular movie, about 20 years old. You know, some of these movies were not as old when I was teaching, but there are pre-formatted questions that teachers have submitted. So to make them educational experiences, to look at misconceptions in science, to ask about, is this plausible, etc., etc. This is Raven, the Science Maven. I'm going to play it. It went viral. How many of you saw this go through Twitter or um, YouTube? Raven, the Science Maven. Hopefully it plays. Body, antibody, bodies, antibody, yaddy, 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 yaddies, antibodies, IgM, IgA, IgM, IgE, IgG, IgA, IgM, IgE, body, yaddy, yaddy, yaddies, antibody, yaddy, 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 yaddies, IgM, IgA, IgD, IgE, IgG, IgG, IgE, IgD. The category biology, lesson on immunology, little microbiology, this is the terminology. I got the vaccine and now you got me on the right night. Be so know the haters when they see them, so it's fight night. Antibody, yaddies make the haters see the bright light. Compliment they poke holes in the chest like a white knight. Opsonizer, baby, that be making tasty macrophages. They be looking, they might eat it up, they might bite. NK natural killers making haters go night night. Neutralizers, rocket shot, replay it in the highlights. Fluid is sticky, stick together like it's white rice. Scary little germs run away cause it's fight night. Everybody asking me, what's a vaccine? Bad B, scientists in the LAB, checking for the right nucleic acids and proteins. We making shots to build up your adaptive immunity, body yaddy yaddy, antibody yaddy yaddy, antibody yaddy. So that's Raven the Science Maven. Her little 1 minute video went viral. And I show that to you, not necessarily for you to show to students, although I think it's interesting to show to students, but it's a way that students can express how what they know. If you go back through that video, you'll see that there's a lot of academic language that she brings up in that video to explain antibodies, what an antibody is, what a vaccine is, and all the different types of antibodies that we have. She broke that down really, I think, eloquently and expresses what the scientific terminology that students need to know. So if we are looking at action and expression, students should be creating. That is the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy now, is to create. And so students are creating. I scroll through TikTok all the time and I see some very creative things. And so it's one of the things that I suggest that we should be asking students to do to express their information and what they know, their knowledge construction, is to create a video. Now, maybe they are artistic and musical and they could do that, maybe not. But there are lots of ways that they can show what they learn in videos and creating videos. So then there's the technologies. Here's some examples. Glockster, those are online posters. Audacity for students to create their own podcasts. That's another way that students create. There's TeacherTube, where there are videos that are supported and created by teachers, polls everywhere to create polls. And then there's Nearpod. Many teachers have become familiar with these online tools teaching during the pandemic. Hopefully they'll hold on to some of those things as we move forward and go back to school face to face in the fall. Here are some accounts, shameless plug. Mine is science.3000 on Instagram. There's another one on that I follow called Latinas in STEM on Instagram, at STEM Media, Chloe the Engineer, and then STEM_teaching are all accounts on Instagram. So your students are, a lot of them, or will be students, are on Instagram. And so what I would suggest is that you encourage them to follow accounts that are educational related as it relates to STEM. But those are some examples. I created science.3000. You'll see there's not a whole lot of followers, but I recently created it because I noticed a gap in culturally sustaining and relevant STEM education materials for teachers. So it's a place to post those types of things. So those are some of the accounts that I follow. I really like the Latinas in STEM. They're very active. The L is language and discourse. Now, Lisa Delpit in 2006, many of us are familiar with her. She wrote Other People's Children, Cultural Conflict in the Classroom. It's becoming a classic. And really, one of the central themes is language. She discusses the challenges that arise for students whose cultural experiences are not in line with the learning of standard English. Now, we know that there are students who have a second language or a language at home that is not English, but there are also students who come to us who do not speak standard English in their homes. So that while they may not have a second language, the academic language is not in alignment with the language of schooling. And she encourages educators, and that's in bold, to be accepting. So one way we can reduce prejudice is to be accepting of various forms of language. And I've had questions about that before from, staunch science educators, high school teachers, asking me, am I encouraging the acceptance of students not speaking standard English in the classroom? And my answer to that is emphatically yes. Because if you are teaching, especially K through 8, all students are learning the English language. They're all English language learners. Now, we know that that designation is for students who are learning a second language, but if you think about what it means to learn the English language, it is difficult. And if they are in K through 8, they are all learning the English language. So if someone does not speak standard English like I did it when I was in K through 8, probably K through 10, I definitely did not write standard English well into college. Here's the caveat. If we are teaching science, we know that, and STEM or math, that those are complex topics that have a whole language. It is literally Greek and Latin. So if science and math are a whole other language, they are learning that language of STEM. And if you are focusing on complex concepts, that you should accept the student's expression and their understanding of that, and you should not correct their English. Conversely, if you are not focusing on complex concepts and the understanding of those complex concepts, it is appropriate to correct the academic language. And so what we'll see is that students will express themselves, the understanding is there, but the academic language is not there. And that's what we should focus on. Activities and teaching methods should celebrate the diversity of the language in the classroom. Now, I have taught predominantly almost 99% Latinx students prior, where some students did not speak English or were recent immigrants. And at times, what I would say to them, because you can see that they're processing the language, is to say it in your native language. Now, I don't speak Spanish. I have a good working knowledge of Spanish. If you speak it slowly, if you speak it rapidly, I probably can't catch it. But for students, I would say to them, say it in their native language. That's for them, not for me. And that's from Delpit. Here are some examples of how we can integrate writing to learn. There's free writing. There's list storming, cartoons, which integrates art. One of my favorites, which is to stop and write. What am I thinking right now? And what questions I have is to actually stop. If we are lecturing, which we should only lecture for about a minute per the age of students. 15-year-olds, you're going to get 15 minutes of their attention. Anything over that, you probably need to check yourself. But if you are lecturing, because lecturing is important to explain concepts, that's a part of the 5E model of STEM teaching or science teaching. There's an explanation phase, and it is during that phase where you need to stop and ask students to write. And then there's the actual writing procedures, asking students to write procedures. We typically give students the procedures in science, and that's quite all right. After they've been given those, we should be asking them to write a procedure to investigate a question or a phenomenon. What would you do? What would you do in step 1, step 2, step 3? That's advanced. It only comes after they've had practice following procedures. Here's an example of something I did once with a teacher, a chemistry actually teacher. We invited a scientist into the classroom, and the students did an interview of scientists. This assignment was given to them prior to the scientists coming to the school and the classroom. And they had a procedure. There were some sample questions. They had to come up with their own questions, and then they had to write a report. This is a way to integrate writing, because there are going to be those students who are English language arts writing centered in your science classrooms. So how do we bring them in? This is one way to bring them in. And there were some very direct directions for what the paragraphs should look like. It is not appropriate to ask about salary. This is from Avid, so you'll notice there I won't go through too much detail with that. But here's the scientist. This doesn't exist anymore. This website, several years ago, Chicago had a whole initiative called Science Chicago. It was a year of science, and you could go on this website and find a scientist. And I've been told that there are still websites out there where you can find a scientist. So I found an African American woman scientist, because the school was 100% African American students. And pre-COVID, she actually came to the school, sat in, and the students interviewed her. We could do that by Skype or Zoom nowadays. You can Zoom a scientist in. So this was her background and her information. Here's some examples of what the students wrote. I believe that this interview makes me put science in a higher category when it comes to my career college choices and possibilities. It's more interesting to me now because Dr. Rabia makes it seem like so much fun. I also understand that there's a lot of hard work. So therefore, if I actually want to pursue science, I think all of these get to that social emotional learning. Student B, I was influenced by Dr. Rabia because she taught me that you can start striving towards your career at an early age. This career does sound interesting because you learn a lot of new things. Student C wrote, the effect this interview had on me was it made things that being a scientist, no, and you'll notice that is the student's actual language, boring. It also made me think that scientists is not only people that really smart, wear glasses and have a life. Right here, we get into the thoughts and the attitudes of students about what it means to be a scientist. You're not going to really get that through a textbook. I'm going to look at student E, where Dr. Maya's work, her name was Rabia Myers, by the way, work. They use a pH scale. The pH scale measures how acidic or basic a substance is. The pH scale ranges from 0 to 14. A pH greater than 7 is basic. What do we notice about this student's writing that's different from the other students' writing so far? What is this student really keying into? This student picked up on the scientific knowledge that the speaker gave. Yeast is a fungus and also eukaryotic that is used as an alcohol product, and it is also used to make bread. So while some students focused on what it means to be a scientist, their careers, all of this it was one period. She was with them for one period. So the last is knowledge of students. K, here's an example. This is my science story. And many of us have known about cultural assets and what students bring to our classrooms. The picture above is the picture in the center is I always have to count, but he's my great grandfather. And to his left is my great grandmother and my great aunt. That is a photo of them in Mississippi. My great grandfather knew his grandfather, who was an African who came to America during the transatlantic slave trade. And that information had been passed down to me. Although I never met my great grandfather, the stories of my great grandfather, I think is three greats, was passed down to me. In the lower right hand corner, there's a picture of me in a painter's hat and painter with my grandfather. Um, that's a picture just to show, what students can bring to you. And I don't think anyone ever really asked me when I was K through 8, why. And I've always been interested in science and technology and mathematics. partly because of this heritage. This is an asset that came to me. As of note, I did not have a formal science class until I was in sixth grade. I did go to school in Chicago Public Schools. We just didn't have science. I had my first science class in middle school. But here I am building something with my grandfather. The microscope above, many of you may remember it, but that was a toy. That's not the actual one. I found it online. But that's a picture of the toy that my mother bought me when I was probably 7 or 8, 9 years old. My mother is not necessarily educated. She doesn't have a college degree, but for some reason, she thought that her daughter would like that toy, and I did. And so that was something that, although I had not had a science class, by the time I got to that first science class in sixth grade, and the teacher told us that there are things around us that we cannot see, and you can only see if you have a microscope, it clicked for me because I had been using this little Fisher Price microscope, and I'm not sure the magnification, but you could actually, in that little book in there, told you to go get little things, and there was a specimen, so you could get a little bug, and you could look at those things. So when the teacher said microscopes, it connected. Those things are funds of knowledge that I had that Mo talks about. Those are funds of knowledge that I had. And then there's a picture with my grandfather again. You'll notice in the background, that's the garage. There's a washing machine. He was the type of person who would go through the alley. They call them scrappers now. And get fans, vacuum cleaners, old washing machines. And he would say, all this needs is a belt. And then he would resell them. So the idea of being environmentally sound or sustainable was a part of who I am. And then there's him showing with the grit of how heavy his catch was. So fishing was a part of our life. Now here's community and school connections. That's me in sixth grade with my uncle at my first science fair project. I'm actually in sixth grade in that picture. And then the next one is me at the International Science and Engineers Fair. That was made possible because my teachers participated in a program for teachers in the summer at the University of Chicago. And my teachers made the connection for me to the University of Chicago, where I would then work on my science fair project with scientists in the real world. So I tell you this as an introduction, but to show you an example of how school and community connections are made for students, no matter what we think the deficits may be in a student. Again, not having a class in science until sixth grade, some may see that as a deficit, but there were things that I had in my community and my teachers who made the connections to support what was already of interest to me. So here's me later in life as a science educator, working with a little boy to build something. As an engineer, we were building little cars to study motion. I like this picture because it shows the interest of the boy and how engaged he was in this, and me kind of taking over because I was having fun too. But nonetheless, this was something that was happening outside of school. And then at the bottom, there's me with students at, I believe that was Northeastern summer program. These are summer things that we and opportunities that we can give our students. I'm going to pause. We have about 10 more minutes, or not quite 10 minutes, but 7 minutes. What questions do you have so far?
Teresa, one question from back. They want the name of that book that Dan gave you.
Okay, I'll write it in the chat here.
Thank you.
If I could figure that out, I will.
Uh, or just say it and I'll put it in the
The
chat.
evolution of Calpurnia Tate. The evolution of Calpurnia Tate. Calpurnia, the evolution of Calpurnia Tate. It's the story of a girl. She's a white girl in Texas at the turn of the century, and it integrates social studies and science. Her grandfather was a Civil War veteran who liked to explore, but her mother wanted her to do all the things that were typical of a girl at the time. But she only wanted to do things that were related to science, what we know as science. It's a wonderful story. If you
Yeah.
can't read it with your students, but if you can, it would be great.
Yeah. Um, are
Go ahead.
there any questions? You can put them in the chat or just on mic.
You can unmic because we're almost at the end anyway.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes before I need to do the closing part. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So here we are. In what ways can we support students to understand and critique the world through science and math? When we talk about changing the world, in the previous session, I heard one of the participants talk about the savior complex, and I definitely understand that. But what I'm focusing on is what we can do in the classroom, because students have home lives outside that we really can't control. But what we can control is what we do and the opportunities we give them in the classroom. So, in what ways can we support students to understand and critique the world through science and math? These are things that I like for you all to think about. And then, how can we shift the role of authority from teacher text to student? And then, lastly, in what ways are you planning for students to experience academic achievement? Because remember, one of the central tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy is that students experience academic achievement. Here are some themes for teaching STEM for social justice. In the slide deck that I'm going to share with you all before we end here, one of the presentations is titled, "What Have We Done?" It's about the earth. There's urban development, there's environmental racism, STEM careers. Students should be exploring careers in STEM to help them set goals. It is one of the elements of UDL. There's food deserts, population growth. There's a lot of conspiracy theories right now related to the vaccine, COVID-19, as a way to control the population. Lots of mathematical concepts really there. There's global warming, climate change, the disposal of waste. At one time in the city of Chicago, you could take students on a trip to the landfills. There's one on the far south side, 94 Interstate 94 East. There's a water waste treatment plant in Stickney. At one time, you could take students on trips there, but because I think it was after 9/11, they stopped that. But I will say, as a student myself, I went to visit the water treatment plant, and let's just say I'm very conscious about putting pesticides on my lawn, what I pour down the drain, disposing of prescription pills, because there is no new water. We don't make new water, and I'm preaching to the crowd. Water issues, and then viruses and vaccines. Here are some examples of informal learning environments that you can share with children and their parents. There's the school site. Some of you have school sites that have gardens and all types of things. You can actually take your students outside on site to do some investigations. There's zoos and aquariums, there's museums, parks, there's technology centers. Chicago and Chicagoland is rich in all of these informal learning environments that are related to STEM. And as a teacher, now we can do a lot of these things virtually, but there are questions, inquiry questions that we can use to investigate those areas. Here's teaching math for social justice. If we think about mathematical tasks, there's 5 areas: ownership, culture and history, participation and positioning, windows and mirrors, and then living practices. And I've discussed many of those as it relates to science. They're similar for math. What opportunities are students provided to see themselves in the curriculum? How do we promote mathematics as something in motion, not something simply to compute, while computing is part of mathematics? There's a mathematical reasoning portion of that. Shifting the role and ownership. How do we support productive struggle? We talk about resilience. I don't tend to use that word when I teach, but I talk about how can we support students to struggle through problem solving so that they feel comfortable with that struggle as part of the process. The resources, what have we done? Disruptive numbers. There's another activity called Plastic Island. that is there for us. But I'm going to stop sharing at this time, see what questions we have, and then make sure to share.
Right. And as go ahead and ask any questions. I'm going to put the PD link if you're looking for PD. The link is there for this session. Remember, you have to do a form for each session. And I'll also put my email there in case you lose that and you want to get back to it. Any other questions for Dr. Robinson?
I had a quick question, Dr. Robinson. I'm just wondering do you find that it's, I won't say more important, because this is obviously important for all students. It benefits all students, but in schools that lack resources, especially for science classrooms, to really focus on, I like culturally relevant, like sustaining that versus trying to focus on the content as much, just because you don't have the resources. So I just want to know what your thoughts were on that.
That's a great question. And before there's a Google Doc, the presentation. I'm sorry I didn't drop that earlier through the presentation, but that's okay because I wanted you to kind of focus and be present. But there is a link to this presentation. It looks different, but it has, and you can fill it in. So all the links to all the activities and things are there for you. Jessica, that's a great question. And the short answer, I think, is yes, because resources are going to be a perennial issue for some teachers. It is a source of inequity in schools, the lack of resources. And so focusing on those things that are related to language, reading, and writing. And I tell my story of science to encourage any teacher that you don't have to have a lot. I mean, nowadays, students are learning the coordinate plane in mathematics in kindergarten. They are doing investigations and working with microscopes in elementary schools. We just didn't have that. And there are many teachers who don't have it now. So I do think it's very important for you to focus on culturally sustaining practices, focus on building their conceptual understanding, focus on building their competence and confidence in their ability to learn and setting goals for themselves. There's a lot that you can do without having the physical materials. It's easier if you have them. Let's be real. If you have them, it's better. But there's so many things that you can do with things from the dollar store, paper, that you can do with students. So my answer to you, Jessica, is yes, it is important. It is highly important to focus on culturally sustaining when you don't have a lot of resources. My information is at the top there. If you'd like to reach out to me at any time, right there. And you should be communicating and building a network with people and sharing your resources. And in times of need, we tend to hold on and hoard resources. It's really a time to share our resources. I have a sister who teaches 5th grade in Chicago Public Schools. She's not the science person. She was complaining about my bugs and things with my little toy. She's an English language arts. She calls me all the time. What can I do? So for their STEM night, the children made origami frogs. You know, you have to cut the paper with origami to make it a full square, but that's easy. And then you get the directions, and the kids loved it. So it's just one example of how you could do that. You
Thank
all
you
are
so
welcome.
much.
You're welcome. You all are welcome.
Okay, thank you again, Teresa. You're getting a lot of comments in the chat, so I think that'll be saved for you too. And thank you for everyone who attended. We are going to do